I was halfway through my Saturday morning coffee when the quiet hum of my campground was interrupted by something unusual, a mechanical clank, followed by the low growl of an engine. At first, I thought one of the neighbor's teenagers was finally trying out that lawnmower he'd bragged about fixing. But then I heard the snap of a clipboard. Sharp, purposeful, the kind of sound you hear in meetings more than lakesides. I leaned back in my rocking chair, holding my chipped blue mug close, and watched as she appeared. Not just another HOA busybody. Oh no, this was Sophie Ward. She marched down my dock like a general leading troops in a battle. Sunglasses on, clipboard in hand. The poor tow truck driver behind her looked like a man who'd been dragged into a bad dream. "That boat's too big," she barked, jabbing her finger at my pontoon. "It blocks community access. Remove it immediately." The driver hesitated, glancing at the water, then at me. "Ma'am, I don't think this is a community property." "It is," she snapped back. "I'm the HOA president. I know every inch of this subdivision. This vessel violates size allocation standards." I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the aroma of roasted beans and mist off the lake. She was wrong, of course. She was on my dock with my boat, on my lake, land that had belonged to my family long before this neighborhood had paved a single driveway. But I knew better than to argue right off the bat. Watching her was like watching a goose try to intimidate a stone statue. Loud, funny, ineffective. The chain rattled as the tow truck driver reluctantly moved toward my boat. Then, divine comedy struck. One of Sophie's board members, let's call him Clip-On Carl since he looked like his tie was fake, slipped on moss and splashed knee-deep into the lake. The whole crowd laughed. Even the truck driver smirked. Sophie turned red, not just embarrassed, but furious. In retaliation, she slapped a neon orange violation sticker onto my boat. The sticker peeled off immediately and, like karma had hands, stuck itself firmly to her own shoe. I nearly spit out my coffee. That's when I heard the familiar crunch of gravel and turned to see a sheriff's cruiser pull up. My brother Tom stepped out, hat low, walk slow, eyebrows raised. "Ma'am," he said in his calm voice, "you got paperwork for this removal?" Sophie spun around, still balancing on one soggy heel. "Sheriff Sanders," she said in her best performative gasp, "this dock is in violation of HOA guidelines." "That boat, private lake," Tom interrupted, hands on belt. "Private dock, too. You're trespassing," she scoffed. Paperwork rattled from her clipboard. A wind gust carried one of her sheets into the lake. It floated on the water like a lost cause. This wasn't just about a boat, and I realized it then. These people, this HOA, had been operating under the assumption they owned everything this lake touched. For years, they've been handing out fines and claiming control. I let it slide, let them fan their feathers, issue their little newsletters. But the moment she tried to tow my boat, I felt the shift. That Saturday morning was the beginning of something bigger, something they weren't prepared for. See, the lake is more than water. It's soul. It's continuity. It blew fog through the pines before any developer started measuring plots. It reflected the storms that cost my grandfather his roof. I've caught my biggest and slowest fish from that shore. I've watched kids learn to paddle and old men retire by this silence. The first thing my grandfather told me about this land was water doesn't know bylaws. It knows memory. Growing up, I followed him down the forest path more times than I can count. Heavy tackle box swinging from his shoulder. Mosquitoes buzzing. A crisp envelope in his pocket that held the lake's deed. Not a mortgage. Not a loan. A legacy. "If you ever need this," he'd said, tapping that old envelope beside the boundary marker at North Cove, "you'll know." Sophie Ward had no idea what she just walked into. You don't threaten a man with a tow truck on land as family steward for 100 years and think he'll fold. That morning, as Sheriff Tom kindly escorted the HOA back up the hill, she shouted over her shoulder, "This isn't over." I just smiled, took another sip. No, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The community, you see, had built up these small walls around themselves, the kind of walls people learn to live with so long as they stay in the background. HOA fees? Sure. A few design reviews? Fine. But finding someone for porch colors? Or threatening to tow a man's boat off private property? That wasn't order. That was overreach. The neighborhood wasn't built from concrete. It was built from trust. By mid-afternoon, I had received more whispers, texts, and casual porch visits than I had in a year. Good people. Folks who've been fined over mailbox paint or told their holiday lights were operationally non-compliant. They sympathized, and they all had stories. I swear she stood at my fence with a tape measure, Mrs. Dallas told me, shaking her head. She'd find me over a birdhouse, Jim said. A damn birdhouse. A fight isn't one with anger. It's one with preparation. So while they vented, I listened. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of my old desk and pulled out the deed my grandfather left me. Its vellum edges curled like old bread. The county seal still faint but legible. Right beside it, I started a notebook. Names. Dates. What was said. Who saw what. Evidence. If the HOA wanted to lead with paperwork, I'd meet them on paper. The next morning, I invited my lawyer, Grace, to breakfast. One of the sharpest legal minds I knew. Practiced property law with a passion and a patience unmatched. When I told her what happened, she leaned back, crossed her legs, and smiled. Looks like it's time to pay attention to what's under their bylaws, she said. Because HOA boundaries don't stretch across water they don't own. I nodded. She told me to order certified copies of the deed and to start tracking everything. It wasn't just about being right. It was about proving it. That afternoon, I spent hours scanning, printing, labeling. Deed. Survey lines. Tax records. I even traced the riparian rights. It was all there. The HOA had no legal claim. None. And a part of me felt sorry for Sophie. Because what she brought that day wasn't authority. It was hubris, dressed in polyester and mirrored sunglasses. I didn't know then what the next weeks would bring. How the lake would become a battleground. How the neighborhood would rise up, not with pitchforks, but with videos, papers, and shared stories. How in one final courtroom, their entire HOA operation would be shut down and their queen dethroned in front of the same community she thought she led. But I'll tell you this. It all started with that sticker stuck to her heel. The day after the tow truck incident, it became clear that what happened on that dock wasn't a passing embarrassment to Sophie. It was the beginning of a full-scale HOA campaign to regain control. But what they didn't realize was this. They were picking a fight with a man who wasn't just living on the lake. I was the lake, literally. The deed to this lake and the land beneath my cabin had been tucked away for decades. Not because we needed to hide it, but because we never really had to show it. My grandfather, Earl Sanders, handled his business the old way, with handshakes, neighbors, and respect. The HOA couldn't match that kind of authority. But they built something else, the illusion of control. Now, that illusion was cracking. And trust me, they wouldn't like what lived behind it. After Saturday's spectacle, I spent Sunday morning in my study pulling out that old deed from the roll-top desk's bottom drawer. The vellum cracked just a little at the crease, nearly 100 years old. My grandfather's name was embossed in beautiful black ink. His signature had that old-style flourish that looked like something out of the Declaration of Independence. The deed described the physical boundaries, pines to the north, the bluff to the west, and most importantly, all riparian rights connected to Sanders Lake to be held in stewardship by the family and their heirs. Riparian rights, a fancy legal phrase that really meant, this water is ours, and so is everyone who tries to bend its laws. My grandfather always said, "Boys, some folks think a rule book gives them power. But a piece of land and time, that's power." And he was right. I decided it was time to use the paperwork I'd always kept tucked away, safely and quietly, to protect what mattered. The first line of defense in the HOA playbook is letters. You'd think a town at war was about to erupt, reading some of the crap they sent. The mailbox out front had started collecting their love notes like a pigeon coop collects feathers. Notice of violation. Unauthorized dock fixture. Second notice. Property aesthetic uniformity concern. Final warning. Mandatory shoreline compliance review. The funniest part? None of it was real. Their jurisdiction ended 100 yards from the edge of my shoreline. I could plant a statue of Elvis holding a flamingo, and it would still be legal. That afternoon, I opened one of those letters and didn't burn it like I had the first. Instead, I slid it into a folder labeled simply HOA harassment. Evidence. Paperwork. Proof. If they wanted to dance in court, I'd bring the entire marching band. Word travels fast in a lakeside neighborhood, especially one that's been living under a reign of clipboard tyranny for years. So it was no surprise when the first knock came that evening. Jim from the Yellow Ranch house. Cup of coffee in hand. Tired eyes. Hands shoved in jean pockets. "She'd find me over a sprinkler," he said, barely a hello. Said I was overwatering without community approval. Can you believe that? My wife cried. That was just the beginning. Within 2 days, I had copies of roughly 40 letters, threats, fines, absurd claims of aesthetic code violations. One woman had been scolded for her porch swing color. A man told me Sophie once stood at his fence with a tape measure and a snarl. When I mentioned the lake deed, the neighbors' faces lit up like the 4th of July. "You mean she had no authority all this time?" someone asked. "Nope," I replied, "and she's about to find out." So I took what my grandfather taught me. Don't just remember. Record. Every neighbor who stopped by shared text messages, emails, recorded phone calls. It wasn't just pettiness. It was a pattern, a campaign of overreach that bordered on harassment. That night, the file grew thick. Something in me felt the satisfaction of setting a trap properly. I wasn't out to hurt anyone. I was out to defend something sacred, but to do that, every move had to be right. Because when a bully gets caught, they don't back down. They lash out. The next step came from Grace, my lawyer and longtime fishing friend. We met at her office the next morning. She looked over what I'd compiled so far, the deed, the maps, the letters, and whistled. "Carl, this is more than enough to put them in their place," she said. "But let's get ahead of it. Order formal, certified copies of everything. Everything. Title history, survey lines, tax receipts, county plats, even the original riparian boundary descriptions. And start tracking the HOA's claimed boundary versus their actual jurisdiction. Draw it out if you have to." She grinned. "They're acting like they own your shoreline. Let's see how confident they are in front of a judge." That afternoon, I drove out to the county clerk's office, asked for certified copies, and pay the extra for stamping and notarizing. If you've ever wanted to watch people's confidence crumble, show them a signed, certified copy of a document they claimed didn't exist. I ordered 3 copies, one for my lawyer, one for my filing system, and one I kept folded in my jacket. Like a sheriff keeps a badge. You could feel it. Something was shifting in the air around that lake. Neighbors weren't just upset, they were waking up. One evening on my porch, a teenager I'd seen fishing since he was in elementary school stopped by with his canoe paddle over one shoulder. He asked me quietly, "Carl, can the HOA actually make rules about water?" I smiled, remembering my grandfather's voice. "No, water remembers what it is. Law remembers too, if you take the time to write it down." That clicked with the boy. He nodded, thanked me, and paddled off into that golden reflection like he understood something deep. The following day, I started seeing a few things around the neighborhood. signs that didn't look like HOA messaging. One read, "Water is for everyone, not an HOA weapon." Another, "Who owns the lake? Ask Carl." I didn't put them there. They just started showing up. Word was spreading. Something was changing, and that terrified Sophie. I woke one morning to find a brand new certified letter slid under my door. It read, "Notice of Community Enforcement Action. Dear occupant, you are hereby informed that your shoreline, dock structure, and boat remain non-compliant with Community Code 17B. Continued refusal to obey aesthetic and safety standards will result in fines, enforcement removal, and possible legal action." Possible legal action. They thought that would scare me, but all it did was make me smirk. Time to suit up. I took that letter, filed it in my growing binder, and texted Grace. "HOA is untethered. Might be time to pull the trigger." She replied in 5 words, "Start counting your evidence pile." So I did. I printed screenshots, envelopes, clicked photos of her violation stickers. I even recorded a video explaining everything next to my dock, calmly, quietly, methodically, because I knew one thing better than Sophie did. You don't sweat a hornet's nest. You remove it entirely, and that removal begins on paper. The fight was coming, and I wasn't going to shout. I was going to let their own actions drown them. The tension around the lake thickened like humid summer air before a thunderstorm. After the tow truck incident, most folks expected Sophie to back down, maybe hold an emergency HOA meeting, send a few stern emails, and lick her wounds quietly. She did none of that. Instead, she doubled down. Thursday evening, I noticed a series of SUV headlights pausing suspiciously at the lake entrance. Groups of polo shirt board members clustered around the HOA clubhouse like conspirators plotting the downfall of the Roman Empire. Clipboards flashed in porch lights like swords. Rumors started flying. They're calling a vote. They want to claim jurisdiction over all docks. They've hired a lawyer. They're going to take your boat. I just smiled and poured more coffee. You see, when you've got truth in your pocket and a deed in your drawer, their panic becomes almost comedic. But even I wasn't prepared for what happened that Saturday morning. It was one of those perfect lake mornings. Sunlight slid across the glassy surface, scattering in 1,000 soft sparkles. Birdsong sang from the pines. And then, click, clack, click, clack, the unmistakable sound of heels marching downwood. Sophie Ward was back, except this time she brought an army. 2 HOA board members walked behind her, one carrying a binder, the other a camera. Following them was a man in a crumpled navy suit with a briefcase, looking like he regretted every decision that brought him here. She had brought her lawyer. I leaned back in my porch rocker, savoring my steaming coffee mug like it was closing night at a theater. "Good morning, Mr. Sanders," she called, voice amplified through a conveniently brought megaphone. "I trust you're ready to cooperate today." "I'm not sure that's what cooperation looks like," I said, nodding to the cameraman. "Sophie," I continued, "when you bring backup and a camera, you're not here for compliance. You're here for a show," which, for the crowd that had begun to gather, was perfect. Half the neighborhood had wandered to the dock, phones out, sunscreen hats on, kids whispering like they were about to witness a magic trick. The suited man, clearly trying to appear competent, opened his briefcase. "Your boat remains in violation of Community Regulation 5B. The HOA has elected to execute removal on this basis. And your jurisdiction," I asked slowly, "covers all areas affecting community aesthetics and shared access," he said with a shaky flourish of a document. I raised an eyebrow. "Shared access? Aesthetics? So you're policing beauty standards now?" Several neighbors snickered. Sophie scowled and gestured toward my pontoon. "It's not just non-compliant. It obstructs visual uniformity. It's oversized and unsafe." "Unsafe," said a voice behind me. It was Sheriff Tom, stepping out of his cruiser like he was arriving at a barbecue. "Sophie," he said, "didn't we already go through this?" Her smile thinned. "Sheriff Sanders, legal counsel, is now present. This is a formal enforcement action." "Legal counsel?" Tom echoed, strolling over and peeking at the lawyer's papers. "You mean this binder full of HOA newsletters?" The lawyer coughed uneasily. "I've got more," he said. "I'll bet." Tom grinned, tipping his hat. "Tell you what, you ask your bylaws how far you can stretch them before you hit private ownership." Meanwhile, he pointed at the tow chain one of the board members had started dragging out of the truck. "That better not get hooked on anything." The audience laughed. The lawyer adjusted his tie. Sophie's face turned tomato red. That's when I stepped forward. "Look," I said, holding up a hand calmly. "Let's make sure we all understand what's happening. Today, on camera, you are claiming the HOA has legal jurisdiction over this lake and dock." "Yes." She lifted her chin. "Yes. Full jurisdiction under community water view provisions." Perfect. That was the moment. The confession I'd waited to get on record. Because 10 minutes later, a Coast Guard auxiliary truck came rolling down the road. 4 officers stepped out, one carrying a clipboard with federal crest. You could have heard the lake stop rippling. "Morning, folks," the lead officer said. "We received a report of an unauthorized vessel seizure attempt." Silence. Everyone turned to Sophie. She blinked. "Vessel seizure? No. This is just an HOA enforcement." "Ma'am," the officer said, staring down at her binder, "are you attempting to seize or tow a registered vessel from navigable waters without authorization?" "Well, when you say it like that, I say it legally," he interrupted. He turned to me. "Mr. Sanders, is this your property?" "Yes, sir," I replied, handing him my photocopy of the deed with the survey coordinates for the lake boundary showing clearly behind it. He nodded and handed it back. "You're good." Then he turned again. "Ma'am, HOA bylaws do not apply to federally recognized riparian zones. Seems like you're confused about jurisdiction." A few neighbors gasped dramatically. "You can't enforce aesthetic regulations on a private dock that predates your homeowners association. If you continue, I'll have to consider this a disturbance." Sophie opened her mouth and shut it. But the best part? Just as the lead officer finished speaking, one of the Coast Guard guys bumped into her binder, sending a stack of documents flying into the water. Kids nearby started fishing them out like it was some kind of game show. "It says visual harmony enforcement," one shouted, waving a soggy sheet. "This one says they can fine you for bin placement," another laughed. Phones up everywhere. Sophie looked ready to break into tears. The lake speaks. It was chaos for her. It was clarity for us. The HOA looked like a band of amateurs pretending they could play in the big leagues. The law was now public. The neighbors, empowered. The lake was on my side. The Coast Guard officers finished their inspection and pulled me aside. "Just wanted to thank you," one said quietly. "Most people don't stand up like this. We've had 3 HOAs try something like this in the last year." "Really?" "Yep. Lost every time. People are waking up. Riparian rights go deep." I nodded, feeling the weight of my grandfather's teaching on my shoulders. Water doesn't read bylaws. It remembers the soil it was promised. As the Coast Guard left, applause erupted. Sophie began to retreat, voice trembling. "This isn't over," she spat. "You'll regret." "Oh, it is," Tom interrupted. "And I suggest you leave before you regret something too." She huffed, stomped up the dock. Her lawyer followed like a wet kitten. She was beaten, embarrassed, questioned, but she wasn't done. I knew that look. Someone who's fallen hard, and think her only choice is to climb out quickly and loudly. She didn't realize yet that her whole foundation was crumbling and that I was already quietly digging out its last stone behind the scenes. Want to find out how I bought the HOA Marina debt right out from under her and forced her into a courtroom she had no hope of winning? Drop a comment and hit subscribe now. Part 4 gets insane. The lake was still breathing quietly the morning the courtroom filled. That judge's gavel was going to ricochet like thunder, but no one knew that yet. 2 weeks had passed since the Coast Guard incident, and the neighborhood buzzed like bees after a breached hive. Everyone wanted to know what came next. Every text, every porch knock, every grocery store whisper ended with the same question. When's the trial? Yes, trial. Because Sophie had done the inevitable. She filed a lawsuit. Against me. It wasn't about the boat anymore. Not even about the lake. Her complaint was dramatic. Unlawful possession of community waters. Obstruction of shoreline access. Harassment of HOA officials. Harassment for defending my own land, apparently. But what made it truly insane was this. She didn't just file it. She filed it publicly, like a grand performance. Flyers went around the neighborhood. Protect our community. Lake ownership on trial. She even hosted a meeting. Probably stood in front of a room full of PowerPoint slides and fake legal jargon. But that didn't matter, because while she was yelling to the neighborhood, I was quietly preparing the truth in a folder labeled Exhibit A, Reality. The courthouse was packed the morning of the trial. More people than I'd ever seen in a courtroom for a non-criminal case. People brought lawn chairs, thermoses, even snacks. Almost every neighbor I had ever spoken to had shown up. Some out of support, others just to see if the HOA would implode live. Tom and I sat quietly in the front row. His sheriff's uniform was pressed and crisp. He stayed silent, but his presence alone seemed to hold the room. Sophie arrived in a charcoal power suit, flanked by her new lawyer, a balding man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She gave the room a tight-lipped smile, the kind that says I'm confident but probably wearing uncomfortable shoes. When the judge entered, my mouth twitched. Judge William Whitaker, silver-haired, stern, a man who fished this very lake with my grandfather decades ago. Not biased, just deeply familiar with the land. The judge banged his gavel. Lakeview HOA versus Carl Sanders. Ms. Ward, counsel, present your claim. The lawyer stood. Papers trembled slightly in his hands. Your Honor, our client has endured repeated non-compliance from Mr. Sanders, who denied HOA authority, harassed officials, and unlawfully obstructed a shared water feature the community has legal access to. Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow. Does the HOA have filed jurisdiction over this lake? Well, Your Honor, common law. Evidence, the judge asked flatly. The lawyer's ears reddened. But Sophie jumped in. Your Honor, it isn't just about legal boundaries. Mr. Sanders has disrupted a community environment by refusing to acknowledge aesthetic normalization standards. The judge's face didn't move. Aesthetic standards. Mrs. Ward, that is not a legal basis for possession claims. She blinked, spoke again. But Your Honor, the community expects him. This is not about expectations. The judge cut her off. It's about law. Her mouth snapped shut. Mr. Sanders? I stood. Your Honor, I said calmly, I have the property deed for this land and lake, including full riparian rights confirmed since 1932 by the county. I have tax records, survey documentation, and certified plats showing clear ownership and boundaries. Grace, my attorney, rolled out a single box of paper labeled Sanders VHOA. She placed neatly bound documents on the evidence table. Deed, chain of titles, notarized riparian certificates. The courtroom gasped. The judge flipped through the first few pages and paused on one. Is that Earl Sanders' original signature? Yes, sir, I replied. I remember that signature, he murmured. He taught me to cast a line off the northern shoal. Sophie scoffed. Objection. The judge didn't even glance up. Objection is overruled, Mrs. Ward. Recognition is not bias. Facts come with history, Grace continued. Additionally, Your Honor, my client has legally allowed open recreational use of this lake for decades, free of charge. The HOA's own filings show no claims of ownership, only enforcement letters regarding lawn chairs and pop-up goal nets. Half the courtroom chuckled. Sophie's lawyer gulped. Then came the moment that tipped the scale completely. Judge Whitaker reached for one of the HOA's document packets, highlighted, tabbed, sticky noted to death. He flipped through it. There were meeting minutes, emails about grassroots shoreline planning, even some poorly drawn maps with crayons marking community view corridors and visual impact zones. He slid that stack aside. These are not legal claims, he said. These are preferences. You cannot fine someone into surrendering their property rights, Mrs. Ward. The lawyer squeezed in one last plea. Your Honor, we believe Mr. Sanders is obstructing shared resources. Judge Whitaker leaned back, tearing off his glasses. Counselor, the only obstruction I see is your client's attempt to enforce imaginary authority. Laughter, which he didn't stop. When the room quieted again, the judge tapped his pen thoughtfully. Mrs. Ward, the HOA has no legal authority over this lake, shoreline, dock, or any vessel upon it. You have proceeded without legal foundation and have accused the rightful owner of harassment. You could have heard a pine needle drop. He continued, It is the judgment of this court that this case is dismissed with prejudice. Additionally, he turned to me. Mr. Sanders, do you wish to press for damages? I nodded once. My attorney will present our request, Your Honor. And like that, Grace put the stamp on it. Reimbursement for legal fees. Damages for harassment. Compensation for interference. Totaled nearly $18,000. The judgment was signed, certified, stamped. Final. The courtroom erupted. Some people cried. Some laughed. Others just clapped wildly. Even the bailiff had to hide a smile. But Sophie? She stood still, frozen. Her eyes looked somewhere beyond the wall, as if refusing to accept the truth. Then she snapped. You'll all regret this, she shouted. I am protecting this community. Judge Whitaker slammed the gavel. Bailiff, remove her. She was escorted out, still yelling, still blaming everyone else, still refusing to see she dug her own grave with every violation letter, every forced vote, every clipboard twitch. Tom joined me on the courthouse steps. Well, he said, that went better than the HOA barbecue. I chuckled. At least nobody tried to tow my car this time. Neighbors surrounded us like a victory circle. Jim from the yellow ranch house gripped my shoulder. You did it, Carl, he said, voice thick with emotion. We couldn't stand up to her. But you. I shook my head. We all did. I just had the paperwork. As the sun dipped behind the oaks and the day winded to a close, the crowd slowly dispersed. I spent the rest of the day sitting on the dock, my feet dangling over the water, listening to the loons call. The lake itself seemed to inhale peace, like it knew the storm had passed. But I had a feeling Sophie wasn't done yet. People like her, people who focus more on control than community, they don't go quietly. No, sometimes they go down fighting even when they've already lost. And the next time she showed up, I'd be ready. I thought the courtroom verdict would be the end of it. A ruling that clear, signed, sealed, and stamped by a judge who knew every ridge and ripple of this land should have been enough to silence even the most zealous clipboard warrior. I was wrong, because when someone builds their entire identity on power they don't actually have, the moment it's taken from them, they'll do anything to claw it back. And that's exactly what Sophie did. 3 days after the courthouse victory, I was standing knee-deep in the shallows, fixing an anchor when I noticed something strange on the water. The HOA kayak. You see, the HOA had one communal kayak they'd occasionally loan to residents for shoreline patrols, or, more often, as a prop for their Lake Preservation Committee photos. But this time, the kayak wasn't being paddled by Clip-On Carl or Sweaty Steve. It was Sophie, right in the middle of the lake, wearing a full blazer and dress shoes, a megaphone across her lap, a stack of documents resting in a plastic bin beside her. I nearly dropped my wrench into the water. That woman was floating in the center of my lake like a CEO marooned at sea, and her expression said one thing: this isn't over. She lifted her megaphone. This lake, she said, voice wobbling through the still air, remains community property by moral authority. The HOA has unanimously decided to issue a reclamation order. She fumbled with her papers, waving them for dramatic effect. Under this order, all vessels, inflatables, docks, and shoreline structures will be considered subject to HOA jurisdiction. Non-compliance will result in deauthorization. The wind caught one page and fluttered it toward me. It landed on the water, and I reached down to pluck it up. The title read, Emergency Territory Ordinance. Lakeview HOA under it. Lake to be absorbed into community jurisdiction as a shared aesthetic resource. I stared at the paper. Alternate universe stuff. Like she was writing a new country constitution using glitter pens and wishful thinking. By the time I walked back to shore, a small crowd had gathered along the banks. Phones were raised. Kids were eating popcorn. Someone had even brought a lawn chair and a free the water sign. Tom, in plain clothes this time, stood beside me, arms folded. She's delusional, he muttered. Can't believe she came back to try this. I can, I replied. This is her identity. She'd rather drown in that kayak than admit she was wrong. Well, he said, nodding toward the truck pulling into my driveway, she won't get that far. Out stepped Grace, my lawyer, wearing sunglasses and holding a manila envelope. Carl, she said, I have news. The court-approved damages order came in early. And not just that. She pulled out a second document. She also didn't pay the prior lien on the HOA marina. It went unpaid for 120 days. I raised my eyebrows. No way. Oh yes, Grace grinned. You're now the legal owner of that marina dock. The HOA owes you $7,000 in back dues immediately, or they forfeit rights to use it. The crowd heard, and the news spread like fresh bait on the water. Suddenly, HOA members started whispering. One or two actually broke off from the group and quietly left. Everyone knew what that meant. If I owned the marina, the HOA couldn't legally issue dock licenses. They couldn't collect boat fees. Worse, they couldn't patrol the water. Their entire shoreline authority was now dependent on a dock they didn't own. Sophie didn't know yet, but she was about to. Mrs. Ward, Grace shouted toward the kayak. We have a court enforceable notice for you. Sophie wobbled in the boat, grabbing her megaphone. You are interfering with official HOA action. No, ma'am. Grace replied calmly, waving the envelope. You're interfering with private property. Your HOA defaulted on your marina lease. It's been acquired legally by Mr. Sanders. She paused. That means you are currently trespassing on waters managed and owned by Mr. Sanders. You could have heard the splash of a cricket landing on the water. Sophie went still, visibly shaken. No, this is a lie. That can't be. It is, Grace said, tapping her phone. I'll have county records emailed to your board members right now. Phones buzzed up and down the shore. A few HOA board members stared at screens, eyes bulging. I stepped closer, voice steady but sharp. Sophie, this lake isn't yours. It never was. You're trespassing. You need to leave now, before we call the sheriff again. She looked around the lake, and for the first time, she saw the truth. Not the one she tried to enforce through newsletters and bylaws. The real truth, the neighbors, the people, the land. Everyone now knew. There was no curtain to hide behind. No legal jargon left to twist. No clipboard could save her. She started paddling slowly, muddling toward shore, but not before shouting one last, desperate claim. "You're all making a mistake. I built this community." Someone called back. "No, you try to own it." She dragged her kayak up the ramp, no one offering to help. And for once, she had no words. No megaphone, just a soggy stack of paperwork and a sinking legacy. 2 weeks later, the Lakeview HOA board voted. Not on paint colors, not on mailbox height, on a resolution titled Proposal 8A, Dissolution of the Lakeview HOA Board of Directors. It passed, quietly, by a majority of residents who finally saw through the fog. The HOA was dissolved. Sophie resigned in writing, moved out a month later. They say she now lives in a quiet condominium somewhere without a lake. Maybe she's found peace. Or maybe she's fighting over someone's window blinds right now. Who knows? Either way, this lake is safe. Once the HOA dissolved, I got more knocks at the door than I had before the whole mess even started. People brought pie, signed thank you cards. One kid even brought me a fish he caught using my old lure that fell into the lake years ago. Tom and I hosted a community picnic at the new marina. A real one. No checklists. No fines. We laughed about the storm that passed and the peace that followed. Someone asked me if I regretted fighting so hard. I smiled. I didn't fight. I protected. There's a difference. Grandpa would have been proud. Not from capes. Not from fanfare. Sometimes they're just people who know the boundaries and stand firm. Not for power, but for peace. The lake is quiet now. And sometimes, if you sit there just right at sunset, you can almost hear it breathing again. Like it's home. Like it's finally safe. Comment below if you want more stories like this. Ever had an HOA nightmare or a neighborhood tyrant? Write it down in the comments or DM your story. And you might just see it become the next viral showdown. And if you want more lakeside justice stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. This isn't just a channel. It's a movement. Canoe Sparkles.